Obsession can often turn into insanity. All it sometimes takes is solitude. And when your entire identity revolves around it, it can make you do things you would never have thought of doing in 1,000 years. It can make you betray your ways, your morals, your identity, and the very thing that started that obsession in the first place. And when that happens, life has a way of bringing things full circle. This story is about Kraven's obsession, redemption, and Spider-Man's revival. With the new Kraven movie just around the horizon, let's take a look at this comic book arc that likely will play into the upcoming movie and its sequels. Web of Spider-Man Vol 1, issue number 31. Death Has Its Ways. The comic opens up by showing us a nude Kraven introducing himself. Smoke surrounds him, and in the background are trophies of all the animals he has killed over the years. Panthers, tigers, rhinos, and elephants. All the trophies surround him as though a glimpse into his past, a testament to his lineage. Kraven tells us who he is as he leaps at a panther in his mansion to train himself. He quickly breaks the panther's neck and flings it away as he tells us that he comes from a long lineage of hunters. Hunters that have perfected the art of taking down every animal in the world by studying its ways. We then see Kraven face off against a gorilla. He mimics the gorilla's movements and then with one swift move decapitates him. He then leaves the hunting room in his mansion as he claims and says, "My mind is rage and glory. My heart is pride and fire. My body is grace and power. I am Kravinoff." As he walks out of the room, still in his bare skin, we're given a glimpse of the outside, a look at the grounds of the mansion. It is midnight, it's raining heavily, and one of Kraven's aides is busy diligently digging a grave in this hellish landscape. It is not the first grave in the grounds, and isn't bound to be the last one. What's more is that the grave already seems to have a tombstone in place. We then see Kraven enter his study as he comes to terms with the limits of his aging body, and then tells us about his lineage, how he comes from a dignified Russia that no longer exists, how his family was once the herald of a form of oligarchy that valued the weak and believed in protecting them, how, if his parents were alive right now, they would be disgusted by this society that humans have come to call civilization. With a drink in his hand, we see Kraven walk into the chapel and approach the altar. On the altar lies an empty coffin that waits ominously. Kraven tells us that no matter his lineage, his family's secrets, the potions he can conjure, he is going to die, and his time is now near. His body is failing him sooner than he had thought, and the prospect of losing out on his number one prey is driving him insane. He says, "I will die soon. I must die soon. Just not yet." We then see Kraven plunge his hand into the coffin and pull out a black spider suit, an ominous sign for the things to come. We then catch up with Spider-Man, who himself is having trouble coming to terms with the harsh realities of life and morality after the recent death of Ned Leeds. Spider-Man swings through the rainy skyline of New York City and lands outside a decrepit bar that seems to be closed for the night. He tells us about Joe Face, a criminal whose funeral is being held inside. A criminal that was a street snitch, which meant that he never had any respect from criminals or heroes when he was alive. Spider-Man tells us that he had used Joe for information numerous times, but that he relates to the people attending his funeral inside. We then head inside the bar and see a group of 7 criminals surrounding Joe Face's body. Joe was living paycheck to paycheck, and thus, upon his death, they all have gathered money to buy him a makeshift coffin and a shoddy piece of land where he could be buried. While they all say their goodbyes, we catch up with Kraven's aide digging the grave in the mansion's grounds. The grave is now deeper, and the man is now waist deep in it. Then, at the bar, Spider-Man makes his appearance, which naturally sends every criminal scurrying away. Spider-Man doesn't blame them, but himself. He knows they are right for fearing the mask, for fearing the costume. He blames himself for being too soft and human instead, for being the person that wears this mask. Because Spider-Man doesn't care about Joe Face, Peter does. Spider-Man climbs down, webs the door shut, and tells them all that he isn't looking for trouble. When he tries to say goodbye to Joe, one of the criminals named Harry tries to shoot Spider-Man, only for the gun to be snatched away from his hand the very next second. Peter then buries himself deep behind the identity of Spider-Man and realizes that his time here is limited. He pulls out a huge wad of cash from his waistband, throws it in the donation pile, and demands that they all buy Joe a better box and a better piece of land. Spider-Man then swings away and reaches his apartment. As he removes his costume and tries to sleep for the night, we see that he is traumatized and haunted by all the deaths that surround him. Uncle Ben, Captain Stacy, Gwen Stacy, and the recent passing of Ned Leeds. He wonders and fears that it won't be long before death finds Aunt May and Mary Jane. As he is about to turn off the light, Peter contemplates crushing a spider on his wall that is awfully close, but he then decides to choose life and simply turns off the light. His last words are awfully similar to what Kraven said tonight. Before going to sleep, Peter says, "I'm going to die." Yes, just not yet. We then see Kraven back in his mansion. He is nude and once again in the hunting room. This time he is letting himself be taken over by spiders and all forms of arachnids. When he has been covered in them from head to toe, Kraven lets out a guttural scream and in a fit of rage begins devouring them by the handful like a maniac. There is desperation and lunacy in his eyes as he continues devouring the arachnids like a hungry animal. This is when we see Peter wake up from a nightmare in his apartment, shaken to his core with terror. As he tries to pacify himself and come to terms with the fact that what he saw was just a dream, we see Kraven and his mouth dripping with the remains of the arachnids as he claims that tonight's going to be the night. Tonight is the night for his last hunt. As Kraven chomps down the last of the spiders, we see Peter get spooked by the same spider he let go before sleeping. It is now on his hand, and out of sheer instinct, Peter ends up crushing it against the apartment wall. Peter won't be able to sleep tonight, and so he decides to calm his mind by swinging through New York City. Peter is more distraught than usual, more distracted, which is why he fails to notice a helicopter flying through the sky late at night. The helicopter is carrying Kraven, and he is dressed in his traditional hunting gear, loincloth, animal fur, and a traditional staff. The hunt has begun, and as Kraven tells us that Spider-Man's survival is a taunt to his entire lineage and identity, we once again catch up with the man digging a grave in the grounds of Kraven's mansion. He is now neck deep in the ground as he ominously continues digging away. Spider-Man, meanwhile, is still too distracted in his thoughts. So much so that he even fails to pay heed to his spider senses, and by the time he does, it's already too late. As he lands on a brightly lit billboard, we get another glimpse of the man digging the grave, and then Spider-Man gets shot at. He manages to evade the first shot, but the second one manages to catch him directly in the neck. As this happens, we hear Kraven happily singing, "Spider, spider, burning bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?" Oh, and before I continue, just a small request. If you have liked the video thus far, please consider subscribing to us. It may be a small click for you, but it helps us in tremendous ways to keep bringing you these marvelous long reads. And now, let's continue. As Spider-Man falls down on the billboard, we see his spidey senses screaming at him to realize that he wasn't hit with a bullet. He was hit with a dart. But by the time Spider-Man pays attention to the voice inside his head, it's once again too late. He begins hallucinating due to the drugs in the dart and sees Joe-Face's soul standing in front of him. He fights off the drugs, only to look up once again and see Kraven this time in Joe-Face's place. As Spider-Man leaps from the billboard and makes his way towards Kraven, we hear the hunter narrate that every move tonight has been carefully planned and strategized. He plans to feast upon Spider-Man today, just like maggots on an abandoned corpse. When Spider-Man reaches the rooftop, we see him still struggling against the drugs and switching between Joe-Face and Kraven. By the time he regains control, it's too late. Kraven smacks him in the head with his staff, which sends Spider-Man tumbling onto the rooftop below them. He is too weak, too dazed because of the drugs. Peter can barely lift his head as his spidey senses begin screaming at him once again. The senses try to warn him that the net that was thrown on him isn't any ordinary net. It has been specifically designed to restrain him. The material is designed to subdue him, but Peter has been too distracted tonight. He fails to pay attention to his senses, and by the time Kraven approaches him and Spider-Man looks up at him, his senses are screaming a single word: "Rifle! Rifle! Rifle!" And his spidey senses aren't wrong for panicking, because Kraven seems to have given up his traditional ways of hunting. He is now carrying a rifle on his back, and as he approaches Spider-Man, he cocks it and directly points it at Spider-Man's head. There is a maniacal hunger in Kraven's eyes, and by the time Spider-Man pays heed to his spidey senses, he realizes he's too late. He can't get out of the net, nor can he escape a rifle shot at point-blank range. Spider-Man desperately struggles in the head as he says, "This isn't the Kraven I know. There's something in his eyes." As Spider-Man thinks this, we hear Kraven scream loudly, "Honor will be restored!" Moments before Kraven pulls the trigger, we hear Peter have the same thought that has haunted him all day. He thinks, yesterday, Ned Leeds, today, Joe Face, and tomorrow, Aunt May, Mary Jane, and then it happens. Bang! And we switch to the man digging the grave at Kraven's mansion once again. His face has now disappeared under the ground, and all we can see is the ominous shovel flinging the dirt out of the grave. The next few panels show the helicopter landing back at the mansion, and Spider-Man now in a lavish coffin, as Kraven and his men stand around his body looking awfully sad. Kraven honorably gets Spider-Man's coffin lowered into the ground, and then makes sure that he is the first one to lay dirt back on it. Throughout this entire practice, Kraven's face is full of sorrow, and his eyes are dripping with sadness. But once he has laid down the first piece of dirt that will cover Spider-Man's grave for eternity, he smiles maniacally and hands over the shovel to his aide once again and leaves him to do the rest of the job. As Spider-Man gets buried, we hear Kraven singing once again, "Spider, spider, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?" Amazing Spider-Man, Vol 1 issue number 293, Return of the Vermin. The next issue begins by showing us Spider-Man's grave while Kraven looms over it and a rat ominously sits atop it. The tombstone reads, "Here lies Spider-Man, slain by the hunter." We then get a good look at Kraven as the rat scurries away. He is wearing the black spider suit, and when he removes the mask, he lets out a cackling laugh. We then head back into the city. It's almost midnight and it's raining heavily. A young woman is running through the streets while trying to keep herself dry by holding up some old newspaper. The scene is juxtaposed by narration from a new voice. A voice that is full of hisses and squeaks. It tells us that people run like rats, and like rats, they always fall down. We then see a rat bounce off a nearby manhole cover, and this causes the young woman to lose her footing. She slams into the wet asphalt with a loud thud, and her skull directly hits the road. As she tries to get up and gather her senses, a hand darts out of the manhole nearby and pulls her inside. She desperately tries to flail her hands in search of something to grab onto, but there's nothing nearby. She is pulled into the sewers with only her bag on the road as the sole evidence of her presence. Back at Spider-Man's grave, the rat we saw run away earlier is back now and Kraven is gone. We then head into the sewers and finally meet the mysterious narrator from the last page as it approaches the cowering woman. Red eyes dart out of the shadows as the woman is attacked by one of Spider-Man's formidable enemies, Vermin. Spider-Man had defeated Vermin alongside Captain America, but somehow the vile fiend has managed to survive and has made the sewers of the city his home. We then head to Mary Jane's apartment, who is busy worrying about Peter because he was supposed to be here hours ago to help her pack up. She's supposed to move in with Peter now that they're married. Side note, Mary Jane and Peter were indeed married this time. However, years later, Mephisto will go on to delete all history of Peter and Mary Jane's marriage. She fears the worst, that Peter might be dead somewhere as she spots a rat in her house. Mary Jane grabs her boot in an attempt to fight off the rat out of her apartment. But the rat is feisty, and in this confrontation, Mary Jane's worry about Peter's health only grows more and more. He could be lying dead in an alley. He could have drowned in the river. He could have been shot, stabbed, or worse, dismembered. As Mary Jane is battling these thoughts, she doesn't realise that she has been taking out her rage on the rat, which has been reduced to a pile of flesh after numerous repeated hits from her boot. Disgusted by the grotesque pile of flesh in front of her, Mary Jane runs away. This scene is again ominously juxtaposed by the rat on Spider-Man's grave despite the heavy rain. We then catch up with Kraven on the next page. He is still wearing the Spider-Man costume, and despite having killed Peter, he still doesn't feel he has defeated him. He still thinks that he needs to prove himself to Spider-Man. We see him leap from rooftop to rooftop until he reaches his mansion. Kraven's talks are on the borderline of insanity and lunacy as we hear him now claim to be his dead foe, Spider-Man. This is again juxtaposed by the rat on Peter's grave, who now mysteriously has its hand on the tombstone. Kraven's urge to prove himself to Spider-Man and to be him drives him to ingest hallucinogens through a mysterious smoke while being surrounded by spiders in a glass cage. He has removed the costume and is nude once again, as he claims that is his metamorphosis, as the spider isn't yet complete. We then see him ingest another green liquid like a dog to amplify his hallucinations. Once ingested, Kraven squeals in pain and doubles over. In this moment of pain, we see him battle his own anchors. One moment he feels his father was a stupid man for having migrated to America. The next moment he feels that his father was a god for preserving their traditions and history. In this drug-induced lunacy, Kraven ends up breaking the glass around him, which unleashes the spiders. Kraven tries to keep himself in check as he watches the drugs take over, and he hallucinates the spiders all coming together to form one giant spider. In this moment, Kraven has a moment of clarity and he is able to become one with himself for the very first time. And all he knows at this moment is the fact that he is afraid. This again is juxtaposed by the rat on Spider-Man's grave. We then head to the sewers to catch up with Vermin, who seems to have made quick work of his recent prey. The young woman is nowhere to be seen, as a grotesque mess of flesh, and a ribcage lies in front of Vermin as he continues to crunch and chew on the remaining bones and sinew. He is surrounded by rats, when suddenly a nearby newspaper catches his eye. He isn't human anymore, but he vaguely remembers what a newspaper is supposed to be. As he opens it, he recoils in horror when he sees Spider-Man's photo in it. Vermin is visibly shaking at the sight of Spider-Man because he remembers being hurt by him and Captain America the last time he was captured. Vermin runs away, but then battles his fear by claiming to be the more powerful one. He vows to get revenge on Spider-Man and then peeks out of the manhole, ready to wreak havoc on the city. But when a spider hangs from the manhole cover, Vermin once again recoils in terror and retreats back into the sewers. He runs away, fearing that he is being chased by Spider-Man, and even ends up killing one of his rats because it was making too much noise. He then eats the dead rat and vows to go up there the next day to face Spider-Man. This is when he hears loud footsteps above, and we see that it is Mary Jane walking out in the rain, hoping to get a glimpse of her new husband so she can put her worries to rest. Mary Jane knows that this is a stupid idea, but she has no choice. As she is lost in her thoughts, she is catcalled by a couple of thugs on the streets. Mary Jane isn't about to take such acts lightly, so she naturally asks the two men to get stuffed, an old 80s slang which more or less equates to get fucked. As soon as Mary Jane's words leave her mouth, she knows it was a bad idea to utter them because she instantly notices the men's demeanor change. We again get a glimpse of the rat on Spider-Man's grave after this scene. We then see an afraid Kraven succumb to the spiders that he is envisioning. They crawl on him, engulf his entire body while he imagines the giant spider leaping on top of him. Kraven battles his thoughts and eventually his fear to realize that this is why he needs to prove himself to Spider-Man. He needs to face his fear. Though a noble move, Kraven's ramblings are proof of a failing lunatic mind. Kraven screams, "I am Kraven! I am the hunter!" again and again, as we see him beat his hallucination of a giant spider into submission. Kraven recounts all his victories, recounts why he is the hunter as he continues to beat up his hallucination, but slowly he begins to tire and eventually lose. The giant spider, made from millions of smaller ones, slowly begins to engulf Kraven's body, and he watches in horror as fear takes over him once again. Once again, Kraven is reminded that he is nothing but afraid in this moment of clarity. As Kraven is getting engulfed in the spiders, we see Vermin mysteriously get called out by someone. He thinks it's Spider-Man, and his rage towards the friendly neighborhood superhero grows to new heights. Meanwhile, as Kraven loses himself completely to the spiders, he justifies his loss by saying, "To become Spider-Man, you must absorb the essence of Spider-Man. You must let in the spiderness. Surrender to it." Kraven's entire body is engulfed in spiders as Vermin snarls and gnashes in the sewers now, more hungry for Spider-Man's blood than he ever was. Simultaneously, we see the rat on Spider-Man's grave scurry away once again, when a spider crawls up on the tombstone. In the streets, meanwhile, Mary Jane is realizing the consequences of her mistake. The men are now following her, and she can hear their footsteps getting closer. She isn't about to let herself get ambushed by street thugs, and so she begins to run at full speed. Her feet land with loud thuds on a nearby manhole cover, and we see it get lifted by vermin moments later. This is when the men catch up to Mary Jane and slam her into a nearby wall. Vermin is watching all of this unfold from the sewers. Humans fighting amongst themselves seems to puzzle him. He can smell fear on the two men, but can't decide what's causing them to be scared in this situation. We then see Mary Jane look up towards the roof and smile. The next second, Spider-Man lands on the ground beside them and smashes one of the men's faces into a wall nearby, clearly breaking a few teeth and cheekbones in the process. The second man tries to run away, but Spider-Man quickly catches him and beats him to a pulp as well. He doesn't stop until a horrified and screaming Mary Jane asks him to. Spider-Man simply looks back at her and then leaps away. In this moment of escape, we see Kraven finally claim his victory by being Spider-Man, and Mary Jane realizes that this wasn't Peter. Watching this exchange has renewed Vermin's hunger for revenge. He is no longer afraid of Spider-Man, and he has been emboldened enough that he has now climbed out of the sewers and fled into the night. This end of the comic is again juxtaposed by Peter's grave, which now has the solitary spider that scared the rat away prominently hanging on the tombstone. Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, issue number 131, Delusional Confrontations. Kraven now calls himself the Spider. He now wears his dead foe's costume and does everything that Spider-Man did, just more brutally. He uses ropes to hang upside down, and right now he is scoping out a crime scene. It is a drug operation, and before long, Kraven has leaped into action and is recklessly breaking bones and kicking faces until everyone is unconscious. This is when police raids the building and Kraven is forced to flee. The detective leading the charge is the only one shooting at the Spider, aka Kraven. This is because Kraven has been working overtime and around 15 street thugs have been sent to the hospital just in the past day. The detective finds Spider-Man's new rampage to be too brutal, but the other officers seem to be appreciating his seemingly rejuvenated vigor. That is, until they scan the current crime scene. Because this time, the Spider has outdone himself, one of the men is dead. We then see the identity crisis that Kraven has been battling with. At one moment in time, he calls himself the Spider and acts like Spider-Man, while the next moment he is ripping off his mask and screaming, "I am Kraven. I killed the Spider at the top of his lungs." We then, once again, get a panel showcasing Peter's grave, with the spider that scared away the rat still vehemently making its stand. The next page shows us a young woman unable to catch a taxi in the heavy rain, and when she decides to walk her way home, she is yanked into a dark and mysterious alley by an unseen attacker. The young woman was talking about a maniac on the streets killing and eating people, which has put the entire city on edge, and we see that she has fallen victim to the same attacker, Vermin. After brutalizing and eating the woman's body, Vermin decides to cross the road but ends up straight in the path of a police cruiser. The officers are horrified at the sight of him and they fail to apply the brakes in time. This forces Vermin to jump up and crash in through the windshield of the police cruiser. He pulls out the male police officer and throws him onto the ground. He then summons a huge swarm of rats and orders them to devour the man. While Vermin is busy watching the male officer get shred to pieces, the woman steps out and shoots him in the torso. She orders him to stand down, but Vermin simply turns around and stares at her. There is a hint of recognition in his eyes, and when the woman gets aggressive, he slaps the gun out of her hands and holds her by the face. Through some twisted mental gymnastics, the woman reminds Vermin of his human mother, and this is the reason why he simply licks her face and runs away. We are then shown Peter's grave again, and this time there are more spiders on it, slowly climbing their way to the top of the tombstone. We then see a shaken Mary Jane pay Joe Robertson a visit. Joe is the editor at Daily Bugle, someone that is close to Peter. We see Mary Jane contemplating whether she should reveal Peter's secret identity so that she can figure out what is going on, but she ultimately decides against it and leaves Joe's apartment with more questions than answers. Another glimpse of Peter's grave shows us even more spiders swarming at his tombstone. Next, we see Kraven torturing a rat at his mansion and planning his next hunt. And when he makes the rat squeal, We see the same fear mimicked on Vermin's face down in the sewers. He fears that something is coming for him. Every instinct in his body is screaming for Vermin to run, flee, and hide. And the creature is right to do so, because Kraven has decided to hunt down the brutal killer that is killing and eating the city's people in broad daylight. As Vermin looks over his shoulder, we see Kraven fling the rat out of his mansion's window and then declare that he will carry out the hunt tonight. Another glimpse of Peter's grave shows thousands of arachnids now swarming on his tombstone. We then see Vermin sleeping in the sewers peacefully as the rat thrown out of the window scampers around him and tries to warn him of the impending danger. But when he hears the footsteps echoing in the sewers, the rat simply runs away to save his own life. Vermin gets up from his sleep frantically, and when he sees Spider-Man's eyes looming in the dark, he gets the scare of his life. A spooked Vermin falls back into the water as he faces his worst nightmare. However, Kraven's incessant gloating makes Vermin realize that this time Spider-Man is alone, and this fills him with rage and renewed vigor to kill him once and for all. The two begin to fight, and although Kraven manages to hold his ground at first, he is soon being flung around by Vermin like a ragdoll. Vermin manages to claw Kraven's ankle and bite it, and this forces the hunter to attack Vermin more ferociously. The fight is a fierce one, but it ends with Kraven standing over an unconscious Vermin, albeit with a torn-up Spider-Man costume. We then see him walk out of the sewers with Vermin's unconscious body in his arms as a homeless man looks on, and as he does so, we see Peter's grave, now surrounded by thousands of arachnids and a hand poking out of it. Peter is back, and there is only one thing on his mind: Mary Jane. Web of Spider-Man, issue number 32, Resurrection. Death comes in mysterious ways, and so does its perception. We see Peter lying in a fetal position in a white void, a void that he finds cozy and comforting. That is, until he is woken up by his dead friend, Ned Leeds. At first, Peter is stoked at the idea of meeting Ned, but when he remembers that Ned is supposed to be dead, he realizes that this must mean that he is dead too. As Peter comes to this horrific realization, he watches Ned's face decompose into nothing right in front of his eyes. Peter then goes back into his fetal position while trying to shut out his nightmare as he hears Spider-Man's eyes calling out to him, ordering him to come out of his current state. Peter then goes back and forth in his brain, begging to be left alone in the warm embrace of the white void. But then he is reminded that Uncle Ben is dead, Ned and Gwen are dead, but Mary Jane and Aunt May still live. Peter watches himself transform into a spider, a crude representation of the mask that he wears as he begins travelling deeper into a tunnel where he is attacked and ultimately sliced open. However, this brings along another realisation, that the spider has simply been a coffin for him, a metaphorical cocoon that Peter is now bursting out of. We watch Peter crawl out of the dying spider's body as the Spider-Man eyes in the dark, calling out to him, slowly begin to pull their mask away. As Peter continues further down into the tunnel, he is reminded of his life, of his newlywed wife Mary Jane, and how much he wants to live for her. He continues walking, now enraged by the last moments of his life, the moments in which he was ruthlessly shot again and again by Kraven. Now hungry for revenge, Peter watches Kraven calling out to him in this memory, and the pain of getting shot again and again begins coursing through his entire being. Peter continues travelling with each shot, but suddenly hits a dark dead end. But he can't stop now. He can't leave Mary Jane. With tears streaming down his face and the pain of gunshots coursing through his body, Peter begins clawing and digging. He digs and digs, driven by his love for Mary Jane, and then he finally breaks out. Peter surfaces gasping for air as he proclaims his love for his wife. Spider-Man has dug out of his grave, the same grave in which Kraven buried him 2 weeks ago. A huge storm is coursing through the sky, but that is the least of Peter's worries right now. He is horrified by the acts of Kraven and the tombstone he was given, and seething with anger, Peter makes his way into Kraven's mansion. Sadly, the mansion is completely empty, and when Peter looks at the newspapers lying in Kraven's study, he realizes 2 weeks have passed. The mask of Spider-Man that was calling him out now peels away to reveal Kraven underneath, who can sense that his formidable foe is back again. Meanwhile, Spider-Man's anger gets the best of him, and he begins trashing Kraven's trophy room to the ground. He tears open all of Kraven's trophies, but then he is interrupted by 2 of Kraven's aides. The aides think that Spider-Man seemingly has expended himself while destroying the room, and they decide to take him on. But the next second, Peter has them up by the throat in an instant. instant. He then drops them after a moment of clarity and decides to go after Kraven on his own. This is when the Spider-Man mask comes off, revealing a grinning Kraven, who is now eager and more ready than ever to prove himself against Spider-Man. We then get a glimpse of Vermin. He is being held in an electrified cage by Kraven. Mary Jane, meanwhile, is having a rough time in her apartment. She tries to watch the TV, but her sorrow gets the best of her, and she simply throws the remote away. She is then horrified when she watches Spider-Man enter her apartment because she assumes it to be the murderer that has stolen her husband's identity. But when Peter removes the mask and reveals himself, Mary Jane cries tears of happiness, and the two share a much-needed intimate moment. However, Peter is woken up that night due to nightmares and the sheer hunger for revenge. Mary Jane tries to stop him from heading out, but he can't ignore his responsibilities, and so Peter dresses up in his costume and heads out into the night after wishing one final goodbye and the promise to come back to Mary Jane. His spidey senses guide him to Kraven's location, who is ominously standing in an apartment lit by torches waiting for him. The Amazing Spider-Man, issue number 294, The Chosen End. The comic opens up on an ominous shot of the apartment building where we left Kraven and Spider-Man. A spider hangs from a nearby building, while a rat whimpers on a nearby trash pile, trying to evade the waterlogged streets of New York. We then head inside and see Vermin trying to escape his electrified cage to no avail, as Kraven tells us about his mother, how she fled Russia and came to America, how this nation drove her insane and she was eventually locked up in the last days of her life just like an animal, and Kraven blames the spider for all that happened to her. As Kraven says this, he is confronted by Spider-Man, who begins punching Kraven in the face out of anger. Kraven doesn't retaliate, but instead smiles widely while spitting out his own blood. He tells Spider-Man that he can punch him to his heart's content because the fight no longer matters to him. In his mind, Kraven has already won. Kraven begins stripping down to his bare skin as he tells Peter that he has already won. He nearly killed Peter, buried him alive, took his place, and became the Spider. Victory is his, and all of this is juxtaposed by Vermin's failed attempts to escape his electrified cage. Kraven then dresses up in his traditional loincloth and leads Spider-Man down into the trophy room in this building. He claims to be Spider-Man's superior and shows him Vermin trapped in the cage. He reveals that the cannibal that has been stalking the streets of the city for the past 2 weeks was also apprehended by him and not Spider-Man. Kraven begins torturing Vermin with a lit torch as he claims that Spider-Man alongside Captain America couldn't kill Vermin, but he alone was able to cage him. This was the final proof to him. Final proof that Kraven was better than Spider-Man. He then tosses the lit torch into Vermin's cage and watches the creature squirm and beg for his life. Kraven laughs at this sight, and his pleasure only grows when Vermin spots Spider-Man. Spider-Man's fear makes Vermin electrocute and burn himself again and again as he desperately tries to escape his cage. Kraven laughs triumphantly until Spider-Man manages to web the lit torch and toss it out of the cage. He then confronts Kraven in anger, demanding answers, but he gets none. Kraven simply leaps on top of a taxidermied elephant and revels in his victory. Spider-Man tosses the elephant in the air and throws Kraven to the ground, but his anger gets no reaction from Kraven, at least not the kind of reaction Peter wants. Kraven instead walks up to him and tries to caress his face as though feeling pity for Peter. This forces Peter to swat away Kraven's hand, which forces the latter to reveal the next part of his planned confrontation. Kraven grins another wide smile and presses a button nearby. This opens Vermin's cage and sets him free. The cannibal, half-human monster falls to the ground and continues to beg for his life. Spider-Man vehemently declares that he won't fight Vermin, and this forces Kraven to antagonize the half-man cannibal monster. Kraven reminds Vermin of everything he has been put through by Spider-Man and manipulates him into attacking Peter. Vermin isn't that smart, and after a few words, he is riled up enough to attack Spider-Man. He leaps at Peter, who does his best to dodge all the attacks until Vermin manages to slash his left arm. When this happens, Kraven smiles widely because the hunter knows what will happen next. Peter now begins attacking Vermin instead of evading his attacks, and moments later, he has the half-man monster on the ground begging for mercy. However, when he hears Kraven's cackles in the background, he pauses for a moment and realizes that he is playing directly into Kraven's plans. He stops and decides to hold back, but Vermin doesn't have this moment of clarity. He uses this moment to his advantage and begins attacking Peter. Within minutes, Vermin has overpowered Spider-Man and is about to land the killing blow, but that is when Kraven uses his whip to shove him back. He then throws a knife through the air which lodges into Vermin's right hand and pins him to the wall. Kraven then sets Vermin free by pulling out the knife, and the half-man cannibal monster scurries away into the city. Spider-Man begs for Kraven to stop Vermin because the cannibal monster will continue his rampage in the city, but Kraven is focused on other things. He instead wants to help Spider-Man. He hoists Peter up by the waist and then leads him upstairs. Spider-Man is confused by all of this, especially when Kraven says that Peter is free to go after Vermin. Peter doesn't want to leave Kraven without apprehending him because he is afraid that the hunter will go back to his old ways. But that is when Kraven reveals that he is done. Defeating Spider-Man has been his last hunt, and he promises, in fact vows to Spider-Man, that he doesn't plan on hunting ever again. Spider-Man reluctantly looks at Kraven, but something about the hunter's eyes convinces him. Promising to return after he has apprehended Vermin, Spider-Man leaps out of the window and leaves Kraven to revel in his short-lived victory. But as Spider-Man swings away, we see Kraven look at him longingly. Then, once Spider-Man is out of sight, Kraven ominously wishes him a last goodbye. A few hours later, we catch up with Kraven at his mansion. He is draped in a luxurious robe as he stares at his family photo while smoking. Kraven remembers his family's escapades and arrival in America once again as he places the photo down in front of a coffin. He then picks up the rifle lying inside the coffin and cocks it. He points the rifle in his mouth, and as the storm outside rages on, he finally does the unthinkable. Kraven pulls the trigger. The impact of the gunshot sends his dead, lifeless body cartwheeling back into the coffin as blood sprays everywhere. Blood drips down from the coffin and down onto his family photo, and then finally onto his childhood image. Kraven is no more. Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man, issue number 132, Final Grave. Well, this is it, folks. The conclusion to the Kraven's Last Hunt story arc. We catch up with Spider-Man as he crawls through the disgusting sewers of the city while searching for the cannibal man monster Vermin. This tough and restricted crawl reminds him of his time in the coffin, and it plays on his claustrophobia heavily. Like the time Kraven was struggling with his fear, Spider-Man too in this moment can center himself by only realizing that he's afraid and by confronting his growing fears of small spaces. But this isn't the first time Peter has faced his fears, so this fight against his own instincts comes naturally to him. He puts his fears aside and continues to crawl through the fetid muck of the sewers slowly and steadily. As he continues to crawl, we are then shown a glimpse of Kraven's mansion. The same man that was tasked to dig Spider-Man's grave is now digging another one while the heavy rain lashes on his bare skin in the dark of the night. Spider-Man finally makes it out of the small sewer and falls into a bigger opening. When he tries to catch his breath, his finger is suddenly bit by a rat and he flings it away out of sheer terror. Seconds later, more rats begin pouring out of the sewers beside him, and soon they begin to swarm around him. Spider-Man desperately tries to fight off the horde of rats while envisioning the moment he was placed in the coffin by Kraven's aides. He clings to the walls and then the roof in an attempt to keep the rats away, and in this moment he envisions his coffin being lowered into the grave and realizes that he has to fight off his fear now more than ever. As Spider-Man realizes this, we once again get a glimpse of the aide digging the grave back at the mansion. His face is expressionless, yet even in this rain, it is apparent that the eyes are full of sorrow. We then see Detective Carson arrive at Kraven's apartment along with the other police officers. They were tipped off by an anonymous caller, and what they end up discovering is shocking to say the least. They find a file with Kraven's confession. Kraven has confessed that he had taken up Spider-Man's mantle for the past 2 weeks, and he was the one rampaging across the city, killing criminals without remorse. He also has provided images as proof, including an image of him towering over Spider-Man as he lies in the coffin. Meanwhile, back in the sewers, Spider-Man has managed to fight off the rats as well as his fear. He is now wading through waist-deep water. However, just when Peter is about to catch his breath, he is ambushed by Vermin. Vermin stalks Peter menacingly, and when the moment is right, he pounces on Spider-Man. Surprised by this attack, Peter loses his footing, and Vermin promptly uses this opportunity to try and drown him. He shoves Peter down into the water and jumps on top of him in an attempt to keep him down. But in this moment, Peter remembers how he broke out of his own grave and musters all his strength to rise up once again. But Vermin is too powerful for him in the water, and the half-man monster is still clinging onto Peter. The two of them fall back into the water again as Peter continues to envision himself rising up from his own grave. This struggle continues as the two of them manage to hit each other and then attempt to drown their foe. Throughout this entire ordeal, Peter has begun to question the circumstances of his demise. What if Kraven did actually kill him? What if he never came back? After all, coming back to life was quite an outrageous prospect. So what is this right now? What if Peter is still dead and this is his hell? As Peter begins to question his reality, we get another glimpse at the man digging the grave back at the mansion. He is now waist deep, and the pile of dirt beside him is slowly growing larger and larger. Back in the sewers, Vermin has lost sight of Spider-Man. Peter has managed to escape his grasp underwater and is currently clinging onto the ceiling in a dark corner. Vermin can't see him, and this makes the half-man monster panic. As Vermin panics and says his thoughts out loud, Peter realizes that Vermin has been traumatized by Spider-Man's attacks. He simply doesn't wish to be hurt anymore and is lashing out against Spider-Man out of self-preservation. Peter then decides to help Vermin and starts by webbing him to a nearby wall. However, in his moment of panic, Vermin decides to call out to his swarm of rats for help, and this forces Spider-Man to punch him in the face to shut him up. Vermin agrees to keep the rats at bay, and Peter uses this opportunity to have a conversation with him. He tries to get Vermin to see that Spider-Man won't hurt him, but when Peter makes the mistake of saying that he will rescue Vermin from the darkness, the half-man monster lashes out and breaks free from the webbing. Vermin has grown accustomed to his condition and has come to love the dark of the sewers. He doesn't want to leave his current abode, and so the fight between the two of them begins once again. This time Spider-Man is afraid of Vermin because the latter nearly drowned him, and so Peter begins to run away with Vermin hot on his heels, hungry for revenge. Peter's costume is slashed, and as he rushes to a nearby manhole, we see Vermin call out to his rats and chase after him. But when Vermin reaches the manhole, he hesitates for a moment and ponders if he should be leaving the sewers or not. His hunger for revenge gets the better of him, and he jumps out of the sewers. However, this was his biggest mistake and Spider-Man's plan all along. Peter had sensed that it had stopped raining, and he had finally managed to draw Vermin out into the light on his own. The sun is just rising above the horizon as Vermin realizes his mistake amidst the heavy rush hour traffic of the city. The half-man monster begins to panic, and we get another glimpse of the grave being dug at the mansion. The man digging the grave is now neck deep in the pit as the sun rises on the horizon, which signifies a new beginning. Back in the city, Spider-Man manages to rescue Vermin just as he is about to be hit by a speeding truck. Once rescued, he swings with Vermin to police officers nearby, webs him to restrain him, and hands him over. He then promises to get in touch with Reed Richards to find a cure for Vermin's condition. Spider-Man swings away as the police officers stare at him in awe. The story of Kraven killing Spider-Man 2 weeks ago and him coming back from the dead is the talk of the town, but Spider-Man has no clue about Kraven's confession, or, in fact, his demise. He swings back to his apartment and has a hearty and much-needed reunion with his new wife, Mary Jane. And at the mansion, Kraven's aides sorrowfully say the last goodbye to their master, their only solace being that Kraven got the death that he chose, much like everything else he accomplished in his life. As the sun rises above the horizon, the aides honorably carry Kraven's coffin to the grave and bury it with respect. They lower the coffin and the dirt is slowly poured on it. As the scene pans out, we see that Kraven's grave is beside Spider-Man's grave, and his tombstone reads Sergei Kravinoff plus Kraven. The hunter here lies with honor. We then see the same rat and spider that were on Spider-Man's grave get buried alongside Kraven as his final words echo once again. Spider, spider, burning bright in the forests of night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Marvelous verdict. Kraven's Last Hunt is a truthful and respectful goodbye to a character that fans came to love and adore. Of course, he would return down the line due to public demand, but this was his final intended goodbye when the comics were being published in the 1980s. The art is true to that time, and the story does a good job of shying away from Spider-Man's more happy storylines that he would come to be known by. Vermin 2, as an adversary, is quite formidable and ruthless, something that was new for Spider-Man fans back in the day. The mention of Reed Richards at the end is a good way of completing the universe, while making sure this story arc spans all the Spider-Man comics of the time. So if you're looking for a glimpse into the mind of the Hunter before the Sony movie, for the character hits the big screen, the Kraven's Last Hunt is a great critically acclaimed story arc to introduce yourself to the character.